except the mystery. For the past couple of weeks, I've been having terrible nightmares. So my father suggested getting fresh air out on my uncle's farm for winter break. My uncle was a nice old man who adored Christmas, so he had no problem hosting, especially considering he lived alone with his 7-year-old daughter, Noelle. They enjoyed my company. I was already 15, but despite the 8-year age gap, it wasn't difficult for me to get along with my younger cousin. She believed in Santa wholeheartedly, and I couldn't help but smile at how cute she was. But there was one thing off about her. She would disappear for long periods of time to play with her imaginary friends. Of course, she hated the term imaginary because to her, they were most definitely real. The topic first came up when I saw the numerous drawings pinned up on the fridge. Intertwined between photos of Noelle and her father were crayon-drawn characters. All of them were colorful, but something about them was just unsettling. The first one was known as Carol, because she loved to sing Christmas carols all the time. There were always little misdrawn music notes surrounding her head. Apparently, her dream was to perform in the North Pole, or so I'm told by Noelle. The second friend was named Silly. He was an elf who liked to giggle a lot and crack tons of jokes. In all the drawings, Noelle always made sure his smile was extremely wide. The third friend was the Snow Prince. Noelle described him as a sleepy fellow who didn't like to be put out on adventures. He refused to ever open his eyes, so she drew his sockets to be pitch black. I found it to be slightly unsettling, despite the cute little snowman who tended to follow him around. In the daytime, we had tons of fun. Noelle and I tended to sit around the fireplace watching Christmas movies, but the nights were what horrified me. The first night I stayed there, I was woken up by some sort of cracked yelling. It almost sounded like an animal, but I'd never heard any sort of animal make any sound remotely close to that. To be honest, I was too scared to get up from my bed. However, the curtains were open slightly, revealing the thing outside. Standing in the middle of the field was the silhouette of a girl. I slowly crept up to get a closer look, and noticed that she had choppy hair and wore dirty rags as her clothes. The girl's mouth was open wide, almost like she was crying out for help. But instead of a normal high-pitched scream, it was hoarse and terrifying. That's when I noticed the large scar running across her neck. She looked up at my window, and I hid my head under my pillow in fear, trying to muffle the sounds of her voice. I prayed that it was just a nightmare I would wake up from soon, slowly drifting back to sleep. The next morning, I waited until Noelle left the room to bring up the girl to my uncle. At first, he didn't respond. The only sound filling the small kitchen was the sink as he continued to wash the dishes. Then, he chuckled. It was a slightly comforting notion, but it wasn't enough to make me feel safe again.
It looks like you haven't been getting enough fresh air, kiddo. Why don't you go take a walk today?
Before I could continue on, he excused himself and went out to get more firewood for the night. It was forecasted to snow, so he kept mumbling to himself about keeping warm. I sighed. Yeah, it was just a nightmare. The words nightmare echoed in my mind, until I was clenching my head from a throbbing headache. There's no need to overthink it, so I decided to actually take a walk. It was beginning to get stuffy in that house. However, I didn't take into account how confusing the woods could be. Even as the sun started setting and snow began falling, I was still nowhere near the house. I sighed and took a seat on a log to think about which direction to go into next. That's when I began to hear giggling. Not just giggling, but it turned into full-on laughing. I froze in place as it began to get closer. I shut my eyes, praying it would go away. Whatever it was, I didn't want to know. Then, the footsteps suddenly stopped. I slowly opened my eyes to see a boy around my age standing in front of me. At first, a wave of relief washed over me, until I saw his face. His mouth was slit at the sides, giving him a permanent smile. His eyes were curled up as he laughed even harder. I fell back in fear, clawing at the floor as I tried to get back up. Despite his deformed face, the most unsettling part about him was his elf hat. It looked so out of place on him. Before I realized it, the boy was inching closer towards me. As he closed the distance between us, I slowly realized his eyes weren't squinted. They were sewn shut. He couldn't see me, just hear me. Mustering all my courage, I got up and began running as far as I could. I didn't even care if I was getting farther away from the house. I just needed to get away from this psychopath. This was truly beginning to feel like a nightmare, and I hoped I would wake up soon. I finally saw the distant clouds of smoke beginning to appear in the sky. The cabin was just in sight. Standing outside was my worried uncle, looking out into the woods. Once he saw me, he rushed out and ushered me inside. This time, I knew what I saw in the woods was definitely not a dream. I frantically told my uncle what happened, as he continued to pile blankets on me. The snow outside was really beginning to pick up, but luckily, the fireplace was still burning bright. Even as I begged for him to listen to my story, he reassured me I had hallucinated the whole thing after being in the cold for so long. I kept trying to reassure myself, but deep down, I knew there was definitely something going on beyond those trees. As the fire kept burning, I felt the warmth drifting me to sleep. Later on, I was woken up by someone shaking my arm. When my eyes fluttered open, I saw Noelle's little face looking directly into mine. She whispered to me, "My dad left to get firewood," and I nodded, still somewhat dozing off from my nap. She shook me even more, determined to get me to stay awake.
"My friends really want to meet you. Let's go before my dad gets back."
At this point, Noelle began dragging my arm, forcing me to get up. I yawned, grabbing my coat, as she put on my snow boots and led me outside. It wasn't until we were in the woods again that I came to my senses. Noelle was homeschooled, and there weren't any neighbors for miles. What friends was she talking about? My mind wandered back to the laughing boy I'd saw earlier in the day. My heart race began to quicken as I let Noelle pull me deeper into the woods. I finally mustered up the words to ask where we were going. Noelle giggled a little and said we were going to see the ice prince. She was so enthusiastic about it, I almost let my guard down. Yeah, she was probably just taking me to see a snowman she built. This is fine, I thought to myself. Finally, we arrived in a small clearing within the woods. Although snow covered the ground, Noelle pulled me to a certain area. Laying within the snow was a boy whose skin was light blue. Ice covered his hair and eyelashes. Half of his body completely immersed in the snow. Yet, his mouth was open slightly, tinted and unnaturally dark purple. As Noelle began talking to it, like an old friend, I realized something. This was an actual corpse, not her imaginary friend. Judging by how blue his skin was, I assumed he died of hypothermia. Looking back at Noelle's innocent red-flushed face, then at the snow prints, my eyes wandered to the rest of his body. His hands were covered by the snow, beginning to pile up. But there was something on them. I dug up the snow with my bare hands, and saw that his hands were tied together with rope. He didn't die of natural causes. Someone had deliberately left him here. Before I could stand back up, Noelle began speaking again.
You know, I really like you. I wish you could stay here forever with me, like everyone else.
Everyone else, I repeated.
Yeah, like Carol and Silly.
I was frozen in horror. That girl was not a nightmare, and Silly was not a fever dream. Then, Noelle suddenly interrupted my thoughts with an unsettling sentence.
Do you want to stay here forever?
I blinked in confusion. Before I could respond, I heard footsteps imprinting in the snow behind me. My body forced itself to turn around. It was Santa. Except instead of reindeer, he was accompanied by the screaming girl and laughing boy. However, in his hands was an axe. I looked at his face and saw the familiar blue eyes of my uncle. The last thing I saw was Noelle, overjoyed at the thought of having a new imaginary friend for her collection. This year, Santa got her exactly what she wanted, which was me. Thank you for watching, and Merry Christmas if you celebrate Christmas. Make sure to like and subscribe. So goodbye for now, but not forever.